Marcus Vale stood motionless in the shadows of the grand conference chamber aboard the starship Celestial Harmony. His deep brown eyes swept across the assembled delegates with practiced precision, cataloging every movement, every gesture, every subtle shift in posture that might signal danger. The Galactic Peace Summit had drawn representatives from dozens of worlds, and tensions ran high beneath the veneer of diplomatic courtesy. At the center of it all sat Princess Zara Nyx of the Ethereal Dominion. Her luminescent blue skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and her silver hair cascaded like liquid starlight over her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality that made ethereal speech so captivating to other species. She was discussing trade routes and territorial disputes with the skill of someone born to leadership. But Marcus could see the tension in the way her fingers traced patterns on the conference table. For 3 years, Marcus had served as both diplomatic advisor and personal protector to Princess Zara. It was an unusual arrangement. Most royals kept their security and political councils separate, but Zara had insisted on having someone she could trust completely in both roles. Marcus had proven himself invaluable, combining his background in interspecies relations with an intuitive understanding of personal security that had kept the princess safe through countless dangerous situations. The other delegates often whispered about their partnership. A human serving so closely with ethereal royalty raised eyebrows across the galaxy. Humans were respected for their adaptability and determination, but many species still viewed them as newcomers to the galactic stage, resourceful, but lacking the refinement expected in royal courts. Marcus had heard the whispers, seen the sideways glances, but he had never let them affect his work. Princess Zara needed protection, and he was the best person for the job. That was all that mattered to him. Or at least, that's what he told himself during the long nights when he stood guard outside her quarters, trying not to think about how her laugh made his chest feel warm, or how her rare, genuine smiles seemed to light up whatever room she was in. The mining rights to the Kepler Nebula are non-negotiable, declared Ambassador Quill of the Hegemony, his reptilian features set in a scowl. Our surveys established those claims decades before the ethereals arrived in that sector. Zara's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around her eyes. She was getting frustrated with the ambassador's aggressive tactics. Ambassador Quill, our records show that ethereal vessels were conducting scientific research in the Kepler Nebula long before your mining consortium arrived. Perhaps we could find a compromise that serves both our interests. The discussion continued for another hour, with various delegates weighing in on territorial disputes and trade agreements. Marcus remained alert, his gaze constantly moving between the assembled representatives and the entrances to the chamber. Something felt off today, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was triggering his instincts. During a brief recess, Marcus approached Zara as she reviewed her notes at the head of the conference table. "Princess, I'd like to suggest we move the afternoon session to a more secure location. The observation deck has too many access points." Zara looked up at him, her violet eyes showing a flicker of irritation. "Marcus, we've discussed this. The observation deck was chosen specifically because it's prestigious and neutral ground. Moving the session would send the wrong message to the other delegates. I understand the political implications, but the security screening was thorough, and your team swept the entire deck twice. We'll proceed as planned." Her tone carried the finality of royal command, but Marcus could hear something else underneath a tiredness that went deeper than the long hours of negotiation. Marcus nodded respectfully. "Of course, Princess. I'll adjust our security positioning accordingly." As the delegates reconvened on the observation deck, Marcus felt his unease grow stronger. The chamber was beautiful, with massive transparent aluminum windows offering a stunning view of the nebula they'd been discussing. But the space was too open, with too many sightlines and potential hiding spots behind the decorative pillars that supported the domed Sealing. The afternoon session focused on humanitarian aid and refugee resettlement, a topic close to Zara's heart. She spoke passionately about the responsibility of advanced civilizations to help those displaced by war and natural disasters. Marcus found himself admiring her compassion, even as he maintained his vigilant watch over the room. Ambassador Thane of the Vorthan Republic was presenting his government's proposal when Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Ambassador Quill's aide, a nervous-looking hegemony functionary named Vex, was slowly reaching inside his diplomatic pouch. The man's movements were too deliberate, too careful, and sweat was beading on his scaled forehead, despite the chamber's comfortable temperature. Marcus's ENHANCED training kicked in. Time seemed to slow as his mind processed the threat. Vex's hand emerged from the pouch, holding what looked like a standard diplomatic stylus, but Marcus's sharp eyes caught the telltale shimmer of an energy cell hidden in space. It was an assassin's weapon, designed to discharge a lethal neural disruptor pulse at close range. "Princess, get down," Marcus shouted, already moving. The chamber erupted in confusion as Marcus vaulted over the conference table, sending datapads and refreshment glasses flying. Delegates scrambled backward as he crashed into Vex just as the assassin was raising the weapon toward Zara. The two men went down hard, Marcus's weight driving the hegemony operative to the floor as security alarms began wailing throughout the ship. The disguised weapon flew from Vex's grasp, skittering across the polished floor. Marcus pinned the would-be assassin with one knee while reaching for his own sidearm, but Vex proved more dangerous than expected. The hegemony agent pulled a backup weapon, a traditional blade coated with paralytic toxin, and slashed at Marcus's arm. Fire raced through Marcus's nervous system as the toxin entered his bloodstream, but his human physiology processed the alien compound differently than expected. Instead of paralysis, he felt a burning pain that only sharpened his focus. He grabbed Vex's wrist and twisted hard, hearing the satisfying crack of bone as the blade fell away. Ship security flooded the chamber, their weapons trained on the writhing assassin. In the chaos, Marcus became aware of voices, some shouting orders, others demanding explanations. But the voice that cut through everything else was Zara's, high and tight with anger. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" she demanded, her luminous skin flushed with embarrassment. "This is supposed to be a diplomatic summit, not some crude action drama." Marcus looked up from where he knelt beside the captured assassin, confusion washing over him. "Princess, he was about to kill you. The weapon. I don't care about the weapon." Zara's voice carried across the chamber, and Marcus realized that every delegate was watching their exchange. "Do you have any idea how this looks? How can I negotiate peace and cooperation when my own advisor is throwing people around like some kind of primitive barbarian?" The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He slowly stood up, feeling the toxin's effects making his arm throb with each heartbeat. Around them, security officers were examining the disguised weapon and restraining the assassin, validating everything Marcus had done. But Zara's attention wasn't on the threat he'd neutralized. It was on the political damage she perceived in his actions. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes other species question our judgment," Zara continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the observation deck. "How am I supposed to present myself as a sophisticated leader when my advisor acts like a common soldier? We have security protocols for a reason, Marcus. You could have handled this quietly, discreetly, without turning our summit into a spectacle." Ambassador Thane cleared his throat diplomatically. "Princes, perhaps we should postpone the remainder of today's session while you deal with this security matter." "Yes," Zara replied, her cheeks darkening with what Marcus now recognized as shame. "That would be best. I apologize to all the delegates for this embarrassing display." As the other representatives filed out of the chamber, Marcus stood alone near the evidence of the thwarted assassination attempt. The security team had found 2 more weapons hidden on Vex's person, along with intelligence that revealed a coordinated plot involving multiple assassins. It had been a sophisticated operation that would have succeeded if not for Marcus's intervention. But all Zara could see was the political embarrassment. When the chamber had mostly cleared, Zara approached him with her usual retinue of advisors trailing behind her. Her expression was cold and distant, the face she wore when dealing with problems that needed to be handled efficiently. "Marcus, we need to discuss your future role in my diplomatic corps," she said, her tone formal and cutting. "This kind of behavior is becoming a pattern. You're too focused on perceived threats, and not enough on the broader implications of your actions." Perceived threats? Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "Princess, he had 3 weapons and detailed intelligence about your daily routine. This wasn't a misunderstanding." "That's not the point," Zara snapped. "The point is that you made me look weak and unprepared in front of the most important delegates in the galaxy. Do you think the Vorthan Republic will take my peace proposals seriously, after seeing my advisor tackle people during diplomatic sessions? Do you think the Ethereal Council will continue to trust my judgment when I can't even maintain proper decorum at a summit I organized?" Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something that made his heart sink. It wasn't just anger in her violet eyes. It was shame. She was genuinely ashamed of him, of his human instincts, of the way he'd prioritized her life over her reputation. "I see," he said quietly. "I don't think you do." Zara's advisors shifted nervously behind her, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this dressing down. "I need advisors who understand the subtleties of interstellar politics. I need protection that doesn't make me look like I'm constantly under threat. I need people around me who enhance my standing, not diminish it." Each word was carefully chosen, precisely delivered, and devastatingly effective. Marcus had been in combat, had faced death threats and political conspiracies, but nothing had ever hurt quite like this. The woman he'd spent 3 years protecting 3 years, quietly caring about, more than he'd ever admitted to himself, was telling him that his dedication was an embarrassment. "You're right, Princess," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the pain radiating through his chest. "You deserve advisors who understand what you truly need." He reached up and began unpinning the diplomatic insignia from his jacket, the silver starburst that marked him as a member of Zara's personal staff, the small crystal that indicated his security clearance, the ceremonial cord that showed his rank in the ethereal diplomatic corps. Each piece had been earned through years of faithful service, through late nights studying interspecies law and early mornings training with alien weapon systems. "What are you doing?" Zara asked, and for the first time since the incident, she sounded uncertain. "What you want me to do," Marcus replied, placing the insignia carefully on the conference table. "I'm a professional, Princess. I don't stay where I'm not wanted or needed." "I didn't say you were dismissed," Zara said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "You didn't have to." Marcus looked at her one final time, memorizing the way the nebula light played across her luminous skin, the way her silver hair caught the ambient glow from the ship's lighting. "I hope you find advisors who better suit your needs." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet chamber. Behind him, he heard Zara call his name, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. The toxin in his system was making everything feel distant and dreamlike, but the pain in his chest was sharp and immediate. Marcus made it to his quarters before the full impact hit him. 3 years of his life, 3 years of believing that what he did mattered, 3 years of falling in love with someone who saw him as nothing more than a useful embarrassment. He sat heavily on his narrow bunk and stared at the blank walls that had been his home for so long. Tomorrow, he would arrange transport off the Celestial Harmony. Tonight, he would figure out how to build a life that didn't revolve around protecting someone who would rather be dead than defended by primitive human hands. Outside his small porthole, the stars wheeled by in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human heartbreak and alien pride. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, there had to be a place where being human wasn't something to apologize for. The transport ship Wanderer's Hope shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its aging engines protesting the transition back to normal space. Marcus Vale gripped his seat's armrests and watched through the small viewport as a rust-colored planet slowly came into view. Titan's Edge looked exactly like what it was, a frontier world on the very rim of civilized space, where corporations sent their most desperate miners and the galaxy sent its forgotten souls. It had been 2 weeks since Marcus left the celestial harmony, 2 weeks of drifting from station to station, while he figured out what to do with the rest of his life. His savings were decent. The ethereal Dominion paid their diplomatic staff well, but money wasn't the problem. The problem was finding a purpose that didn't involve standing in the shadow of someone who saw him as an embarrassment. "Attention passengers," crackled the pilot's voice over the intercom. "We're beginning our descent to Titan's Edge. Local time is 1400 hours. Temperature is a balmy -15 Celsius, and the atmospheric processors are working at about 60% efficiency. Try not to breathe too deeply when we dock." Marcus almost smiled at that. After 3 years of climate-controlled diplomatic vessels and palatial royal quarters, a little harsh atmosphere might be exactly what he needed. The spaceport was barely worthy of the name, just a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounding a handful of landing pads. As Marcus disembarked with his single duffel bag, he was struck by how different everything felt from the polished corridors of royal starships. Here, the air had a metallic taste and carried the sound of heavy machinery. People moved with purpose, their clothes practical rather than fashionable, their faces weathered by honest work under an alien sun. "You look lost, friend." Marcus turned to find a woman approaching him across the landing pad. She was probably in her early 40s, with short auburn hair streaked with premature gray, and the kind of lean build that came from physical work rather than gym conditioning. Her clothes were practical reinforced work pants, steel-toed boots, and a jacket that had seen better decades, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone used to being in charge. "I'm looking for the Colonial Administration Office," Marcus said. "I heard there might be work available." The woman extended a calloused hand. "Jenna Torres, Colony Supervisor. And you'd be Marcus Vale, unless I miss my guess." "Word travels fast out here. We heard about a former royal advisor looking for a fresh start." Marcus shook her hand, impressed by her firm grip. "News really does travel fast. I only decided to come here 3 days ago. The transport pilot's wife runs our communications hub," Jenna explained with a wry smile. She mentioned a passenger who looked like he was running from something expensive. "Plus, your diplomatic credentials were flagged in our security system the moment you booked passage." "I'm not running from anything illegal," Marcus said quickly. "Didn't say you were. But a man with your background doesn't come to a place like Titan's Edge unless he's looking to disappear for a while." Jenna gestured toward a battered ground vehicle parked nearby. "Come on, I'll give you the tour, and we can talk about what kind of work you're interested in." As they drove through the small settlement, Jenna pointed out the various facilities that kept the colony functioning. The atmospheric processors that made the air breathable, the geothermal plants that provided power, the hydroponic farms that supplemented their food supplies. Everything was functional rather than beautiful, built to last rather than impress. "We're sitting on some of the richest titanium deposits in this sector," Jenna explained as they passed a group of miners heading toward the entrance to the underground tunnels. "Corporate pays decent wages, and most of the work is automated, but this is still a dangerous business. Equipment failures, tunnel collapses, atmospheric leaks. There are a dozen ways to die down there if people get careless or stupid. What kind of work were you thinking of offering me? Marcus asked. Well, your file says you have experience in security and personnel management. Right now, our safety supervisor is a drunk who couldn't spot a gas leak if it was painted bright red, and our security chief spends most of his time playing cards in the cantina. We could use someone who actually gives a damn about keeping people alive. Marcus felt a familiar stirring of interest. What happened to the previous safety supervisor? Tunnel collapsed 2 months ago. Could have been prevented if someone had been paying attention to the structural stress monitors, but our drunk supervisor was too busy nursing a hangover to notice the warning signs. 3 good miners died because of his negligence. The weight of responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a familiar coat. These weren't diplomats playing political games or royals worried about their image. These were working people whose lives depended on someone doing their job competently. It was exactly the kind of purpose he'd been searching for. I'm interested, he said. Jenna pulled up in front of a squat building marked Administration. Good, because I've already prepared your paperwork. Your quarters are basic, a small apartment in the residential block, but they're private, and the heat works most of the time. Pay is about 1/10 of what you are making with the ethereals, but the cost of living out here is pretty reasonable. Money isn't my primary concern right now. I figured as much. Someone running from a broken heart usually isn't. Marcus shot her a sharp look, but Jenna's expression was sympathetic rather than mocking. Is it that obvious? You've got that look, she said gently. Like someone who gave everything to someone who didn't appreciate what they had. I've seen it before, hell. I've worn it myself. The good news is that hard work and honest people are pretty good medicine for that particular condition. Marcus's quarters were indeed basic, a small living area, a bedroom barely large enough for a single bed, and a kitchenette that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. But the windows offered a view of the mining operation and the rugged landscape beyond, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like he might be able to sleep without dreaming about violet eyes and silver hair. His first day on the job began before dawn. Marcus met with the day shift supervisors to review safety protocols and equipment status. The miners were initially skeptical another management type brought in to tell them how to do jobs they'd been doing for years. Marcus won them over by asking questions instead of giving orders. The atmospheric monitors in Tunnel 7 are showing irregular readings, reported Finn Reeves, a young mechanic whose hands were permanently stained with machine oil. The equipment says everything's fine, but the readings fluctuate every few hours. When did the fluctuations start? Marcus asked, studying the datapad Finn handed him. About a week ago. Previous supervisor said it was probably just sensor drift, nothing to worry about. Marcus frowned at the data. During his years protecting Princess Zara, he'd learned to trust his instincts about things that seemed wrong. What's your gut telling you about this? Finn looked surprised that anyone was asking his opinion. Honestly, I think there's a microfracture in the tunnel wall that's allowing atmospheric pressure to bleed through. Nothing catastrophic yet, but if it gets worse, it could destabilize the entire tunnel section. Marcus finished. Show me. They spent the morning in Tunnel 7, Marcus crawling through maintenance shafts and examining structural supports, while Finn explained the mining operation's technical details. The young mechanic was clearly brilliant. He'd jury-rigged solutions to a dozen different equipment, problems using nothing but spare parts and ingenuity. But he'd been ignored by the previous safety supervisor. There, Finn said, pointing to a hairline crack in the tunnel's reinforced wall. You can barely see it, but if you put your hand near it, you can feel the pressure differential. Marcus pressed his palm against the wall and felt the subtle movement of air. How long before this becomes dangerous? Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be days. But if that crack propagates along the stress lines, double quotes, Finn traced his finger along the wall, showing how the fracture could spread. We'd have about 10 minutes to evacuate before the whole section came down. Then we shut down this tunnel until it can be properly reinforced, Marcus decided. I'll talk to Jenna about bringing in structural engineers from the corporate office. Finn stared at him. You're really going to shut down an entire tunnel based on my opinion? That's going to cost thousands of credits in lost production. Better than losing lives, because we ignored a problem we could have fixed, Marcus replied. How many miners work this section? 12 on each shift, so 36 people total. 36 lives are worth more than any amount of lost production. We'll find ways to make up the credits we can't make up dead miners. Word of Marcus's decision spread quickly through the colony. Some of the miners grumbled about lost overtime pay, but most seemed relieved that someone was finally taking safety seriously. Jenna supported his call, and within days, CORPORATE engineers arrived to assess and repair the structural damage. You were right, Jenna told him as they watched the repair crew working in Tunnel 7. The engineers found 3 more microfractures that would have caused a catastrophic collapse within the week. Finn's analysis was spot on. He's brilliant, Marcus said. Why wasn't he the safety supervisor instead of the drunk? Politics, Jenna replied with a grimace. Corporate likes to send their own people for management positions. Finn doesn't have the right credentials on paper, even though he knows more about this operation than anyone else. Marcus made a mental note to include Finn in all future safety assessments. The young mechanic reminded him of himself, in some ways competent, dedicated, but overlooked because he didn't fit the expected mold. As weeks passed, Marcus settled into the rhythm of colony life. He instituted daily safety briefings, modernized the emergency response protocols, and worked with each mining team to identify and address potential hazards. The work was satisfying in a way that diplomatic negotiations had never been. When he prevented an accident or solved a problem, the results were immediate and measurable. Lives were saved, injuries prevented, families kept intact. The miners began to trust him, sharing their concerns and suggestions without fear of being dismissed or ignored. Marcus learned their names, their backgrounds, their families. There was Hassan Okafor, a former Starship engineer who'd come to Titan's Edge to pay off gambling bets and stayed because he'd found peace in the steady work. Maria Santos, a tough-as-nails tunnel foreman who'd been mining for 20 years and could spot trouble before the instruments picked it up. Tom Chun, a quiet explosives expert whose careful work had prevented dozens of accidents over the years, were good people doing honest work, and Marcus found himself caring about them in a way that felt clean and uncomplicated. They valued his skills and appreciated his dedication without any of the political calculations that had poisoned his relationship with Princess Zara. In the evenings, Marcus often joined the miners in the colony's small cantina. The conversations were different from the carefully orchestrated social events he'd attended as a royal advisor. People spoke honestly about their lives, their hopes, their fears. They asked about his past, but didn't pry when he kept his answers general. You know, Hassan said one evening as they shared a drink after a particularly long shift, when we first heard about a former royal advisor coming to work safety, most of us figured you'd last maybe a week. Thought you'd take one look at the conditions here and run back to your fancy starships. What changed your minds? Marcus asked. You listen, Maria said simply, and you act on what you hear. Most management types, they ask for our input because they have to, but they've already made up their minds about what they're going to do. You actually care about our opinions. Your opinions keep people alive, Marcus replied. Why wouldn't I care about them? Hassan laughed. Spoken like someone who's never worked corporate before. Trust me, caring about worker opinions isn't exactly standard management practice. As Marcus walked back to his quarters that night, he reflected on how different his life had become. 3 months ago, he'd been Marcus Vale, diplomatic advisor to ethereal royalty, constantly worried about protocol and political implications. Now he was just Marcus, safety supervisor for a mining colony on the edge of nowhere, and somehow that felt like a promotion. He paused outside his apartment and looked up at the alien stars wheeling overhead. Somewhere out there, Princess Zara was probably attending another diplomatic function, surrounded by advisors who knew better than to embarrass her with their primitive human instincts. Marcus wondered if she ever thought about him, if she ever missed having someone who cared more about her safety than her reputation. But those thoughts came less frequently now, and they hurt less when they did come. Marcus was building something new here on Titan's Edge, not just a career, but a life. A life where being human wasn't something to apologize for, where dedication was valued over discretion, where the measure of a man was what he did rather than what species he belonged to. As he settled into bed, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: contentment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new lives to protect. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Princess Zara Nyx stood before the massive viewport in her private quarters aboard the diplomatic cruiser Starlight Sovereign, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace streak past in ribbons of impossible light. 4 months had passed since Marcus Vale had walked out of her life. 4 months of telling herself that she'd made the right decision, that his departure had been necessary for her political career. So why did she feel so empty? "Your Highness," came a respectful voice from behind her. "The Vanguard security team requests a moment of your time." Zara turned to see her new chief advisor, Theron Cast, standing in the doorway with his usual perfect posture and carefully neutral expression. Everything about Theron was exactly what the Ethereal Council expected in a royal advisor. He was well educated, politically astute, from an ancient noble family, and most importantly, he was pure ethereal. No embarrassing human complications to worry about. "Send them in," Zara said, settling into her chair with the practiced grace expected of royalty. Captain Vex Jorain entered with 2 of his subordinates, their black and silver uniforms immaculate, their weapons gleaming with professional care. The Vanguard were elite warriors from the military planet Nexer Prime, renowned throughout the galaxy for their skill and discretion. They were exactly the kind of protection detail that other royals respected: sophisticated, invisible when necessary, and utterly professional. They were also completely useless. "Princess," Captain Joran began in his clipped military tone, "we've completed our security assessment of tomorrow's cultural exchange on Harmony Station. The venue presents several challenges, but we've developed protocols to minimize exposure while maintaining diplomatic appearances." Zara nodded, trying to focus on his words rather than the growing sense of unease in her chest. "What kind of challenges?" "Multiple access points, civilian crowds, and limited sightlines in the main exhibition hall. However, we've arranged for discrete surveillance positions and established clear evacuation routes should the situation require immediate extraction." It all sounded very professional and thorough, but Zara found herself thinking about how Marcus would have approached the same situation. He wouldn't have been satisfied with protocols and evacuation routes. He would have walked the venue himself, talked to the local staff, identified potential threats that wouldn't show up in any security assessment. Marcus had possessed an intuitive understanding of danger. That went beyond technical training. "Have you coordinated with local security forces?" she asked. "Standard diplomatic protocols have been followed, Your Highness. We've shared our basic security requirements with station personnel, but operational details remain classified to maintain security integrity." Marcus would have built relationships with the local security team, learned their strengths and weaknesses, made them partners rather than potential liabilities. But Zara pushed those thoughts away. Marcus was gone, and she needed to work with the protection she had. "Very well, Captain. Please ensure your team is in position 2 hours before the event begins." The vanguard team withdrew with military precision, leaving Zara alone with Theron. Her advisor waited until the door sealed before speaking. "Princess, if I may offer an observation, you seem troubled by something. Is there a security concern you'd like to discuss?" Zara almost laughed at the irony. Her new advisor was asking if she had security concerns, when her old advisor had been the only thing standing between her and a dozen different threats over the years. "Just Kree-event nerves, Theron. Nothing to worry about." But as the Starlight Sovereign dropped out of hyperspace near Harmony Station, Zara's unease only grew stronger. The cultural exchange was meant to be a celebration of interspecies cooperation artists, musicians and performers from dozens of worlds gathering to share their traditions. It should have been a joyful, low-risk event, but something felt wrong. Harmony Station was a marvel of engineering, a massive rotating habitat that served as neutral ground for diplomatic and cultural activities. The main exhibition hall was indeed challenging from a security perspective, a vast space with soaring ceilings, multiple levels connected by graceful bridges, and crowds of civilians from every major species in the galaxy. As Zara entered the hall for the opening ceremony, she found herself automatically cataloging the same details that Marcus had always noticed. The Centauri delegation clustered near the emergency exits, a sign of their species' natural paranoia. The hegemony representatives kept checking their personal communicators, suggesting they were coordinating with someone off-station. Several unaffiliated traders were moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of people who spent their lives reading situations for profit opportunities or threats. Marcus would have spotted all of this and more. He would have positioned himself where he could watch both the crowds and the entrances, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. The vanguard team, for all their technical competence, remained in their assigned positions like pieces on a chessboard, following protocols rather than adapting to developing situations. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. Zara gave her opening address about the importance of cultural exchange in building lasting peace between species. Artists from a dozen worlds performed, displaying talents that ranged from hauntingly beautiful music to gravity-defying dance. The crowd was appreciative and enthusiastic, exactly the kind of positive atmosphere that made diplomatic breakthroughs possible, which made it all the more shocking when the first explosion shattered the far end of the exhibition hall. Chaos erupted instantly. Civilians screamed and ran in every direction as emergency alarms wailed throughout the station. Security barriers slammed down, sealing the hall's main exits and trapping everyone inside. Through the smoke and confusion, Zara could see armed figures moving with military precision, not random terrorists, but a coordinated assault team. "Princess, this way." Captain Jorn appeared at her side, his weapon drawn and his team moving to surround her. "We need to reach the emergency evacuation point immediately." But as they moved toward their planned escape route, Zara realized with growing horror that the attackers had anticipated their protocols. Another explosion sealed the evacuation corridor, and armed figures were already in position to intercept them. The vanguard had followed their training perfectly, but their training had been compromised. "They knew our security plan," she said, the words barely audible over the sound of weapons fire. "Impossible," Captain Joran replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our protocols are classified at the highest levels." A bolt of energy seared past Zara's head, and she found herself pressed against a decorative pillar while the vanguard returned fire. This was exactly the kind of situation where Marcus had always excelled, not following predetermined protocols, but adapting instantly to unexpected threats. He would have had backup plans for the backup plans, alternative routes that weren't in any official security assessment. "Princess," one of the vanguard soldiers called out, "we're surrounded. Recommend immediate surrender under diplomatic immunity protocols." "Negative," Captain Joran snapped back. "Our orders are to protect the princess at all costs. But Zara could see that their situation was hopeless. The attackers had them pinned down with nowhere to retreat, and more armed figures were moving to flank their position. A vanguard were brave and well-trained, but they were following a playbook that their enemies had already read. Marcus would never have let them get trapped like this. Marcus would have noticed the subtle signs of an ambush, the coordinated movement of seemingly random civilians, the way certain exits had been quietly sealed before the attack began. Marcus would have gotten her out before the first shot was fired. The realization hit Zara with devastating clarity. She was going to die because she'd been too proud to keep the one person who could have saved her. Princess Zara Nyx of the Ethereal Dominion. Her amplified voice called out through the smoke. Surrender yourself, and your guards will be spared. You have 60 seconds to comply. Captain Joran looked at her with grim determination. We fight, Your Highness. It's what we're trained for. But Zara was thinking about Marcus, about the 12 times he'd saved her life, about the way he'd always seemed to know where danger was coming from before anyone else. She thought about their last conversation, about the look in his dark eyes when she'd called him primitive and embarrassing. She thought about how he'd quietly placed his diplomatic insignia on the conference table and walked away without a single word of recrimination. She thought about how much she missed him, how much she'd missed him every day since he'd left, how empty and vulnerable she'd felt without his steady presence watching over her. The political advantages of having vanguard protection meant nothing when those protectors couldn't actually protect her. 30 seconds, Princess. We grow impatient. Zara closed her eyes and made a decision that Marcus would have understood, even if the vanguard didn't. Captain Joran, stand down. I'm going to surrender. Princess, I cannot allow. That's an order. Captain. Zara stepped out from behind the pillar, her hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. I am Princess Zara Nyx of the Ethereal Dominion. I surrender under the Galactic Convention for the treatment of diplomatic personnel. The lead attacker, a scarred hegemony operative, gestured for his team to lower their weapons. Very wise, Princess. Your cooperation will be noted in our report to our employers. As restraints were placed on her wrists, Zara found herself thinking about Marcus one more time. If he were here, this never would have happened. Not because he was physically superior to the vanguard, though he was certainly capable, but because he understood something they didn't. Protection wasn't just about following protocols and maintaining professional distance. It was about caring deeply enough to notice the details that everyone else missed, about being willing to look foolish or primitive if that's what it took to keep someone safe. Marcus had cared about her safety more than his own reputation, more than political correctness, more than anything else in the galaxy. And she'd thrown that away because she'd cared more about looking strong than actually being protected. As the attackers led her toward their escape vessel, Zara made herself a promise. If she survived this, if by some miracle she made it through whatever her captors had planned, she would find Marcus Vale and tell him what she should have said 4 months ago. She would tell him that she was sorry. She would tell him that he'd been right to prioritize her life over her reputation. And if he was willing to listen, she would tell him that she'd spent every day since he left wishing she could take back every harsh word she'd spoken. Most importantly, she would tell him the truth she'd been too proud and too scared to admit, that somewhere during those 3 years of working together, of him quietly standing in the shadows while she conducted diplomacy, of him risking his life again and again to keep her safe, she had fallen in love with him. The transport ship's engines fired as they lifted away from Harmony Station, carrying Princess Zara Nyx into an uncertain future. But for the first time in 4 months, she knew exactly what she wanted, not just to survive, but to find her way back to the man who'd always known how to keep her safe, even from herself. Behind them, the vanguard team could only watch helplessly as their charge disappeared into the darkness between the stars. Their perfect protocols and professional training proven worthless when it mattered most. They would file their reports, analyze their failures, and recommend procedural improvements. But they would never understand what Marcus Vail had known instinctively, that sometimes the most important part of protection isn't the technical expertise or the advanced training. Sometimes it's simply caring enough to stay alert when everyone else is relaxed, to trust instincts over protocols, and to put someone else's safety above your own pride. That understanding had made Marcus irreplaceable, and Princess Zara was about to learn just how much she'd lost when she let him walk away.